Hello there, and good morning. I would like to thank you all for tuning into our live stream. Today we have a really great topic for anyone interested in the field of technology education or education as a whole. We're going to be looking at language and STEM in relation to what the current literature landscape is saying about these two very interconnected topics. Our guest for today is an expert in these very subjects. He has a master's degree in linguistics and literature and has extensive experience teaching Dutch, English, and expression. His work focuses on alternative working methods for both language review and literature. He is currently a teacher trainer at AP University of Applied Sciences and is also a language policy advisor at AP University of Applied Sciences. With that, we would like to welcome Dennis Venderkin to the stream.
Thank you, and thank you for having me.
All right.
So we'll start off with our first question. Do you think that a high school teacher's undergraduate degree and the course that they focused on play a role in how effectively they are able to express academic language?
That's a good question because the answer is both yes and no. Yes, to the extent that the greater mental lexicon you develop by studying a certain field will eventually have an impact on how well you are able to express that field to others. So it's not only that your mental lexicon will grow and expand by studying a certain field, but also that the connections between them will become stronger. So the morphemes and the words, as it were, in your brain are connected in a more strict way. And also you have some flexibility involved, that when you are confronted by difficult questions from your students, you are able to use various methods to answer that question. You also have developed a familiarity in certain genres that a student may have to confront. But also, on the other hand, no, you will not automatically be a better student because you have been exposed to some language. You need to be really aware of what you are doing. So you have a broad framework from which you can pick your bag of treasures, but you then have to really be, it's not that there are some treasures on the beach buried somewhere in the sand, but your teacher training is still the treasure map that you need to find the treasures in themselves. So you know by studying a certain field that there are some treasures to be had. But the teacher training is absolutely necessary and essential, otherwise you will not have an advantage to another student.
That's interesting. Okay, so we're going to move into the second question. There seems to be some disagreement among educators regarding how to best teach science and technology. Do you think that technology education in general lacks general consensus on how to best teach the subject?
Really give my personal view on, because I've never been teaching either sciences or technology. But what I can tell from experience is that there is little to no overlap with teaching languages, and that's always been quite a shame in my regard, because when I was studying as a pupil in high school, I was studying science and mathematics, and it's only later that I really got into languages. And I always missed languages and science communication for that part as a part of the field. And I think that there is some interesting things happening right now. I think the Anglo-Saxon world is really good at that, with a lot of science comedy, for example, springing up around the world. But I think there's some quick gains to be had from the mixing of those two, and to bring that into the classroom to really, on the one hand, entice kids to come and study the sciences, but also to find and discover that the way you talk about sciences can create enthusiasm with your peers to and to talk about sciences with your friends, that it's not a dull affair, and that technology is not a dull affair either. I think the best gain that can be had here is to put languages into the mix. and I know that there's a lot of debate about should you talk about hosting a conference for science and technology, or should you split them apart or anything. I think a holistic view is always the best way. So you can combine maths, sciences, technology, but also languages to have this broad view. When I was a host of your university, I was welcomed with open arms as the language professor that I am. And I think I could make some remarks and comments that were useful to you. Well, I hope I did. And that's also because you have an outsider view. And I think if you bring in the critical outsider, there's always something that can be gained from that.
Thank you for your insight. Do you think that students need a baseline of technological language proficiency to meaningfully participate in the design process?
Create some barriers to success. If a kid is enthusiastic about wanting to be involved in the process, it should be. And that also goes back to something we call deficit-based language learning, where you should have acquired. This is done a lot, though, throughout the world. But if you build these kind of barriers, you will build barriers that some kids will not access a certain field. And if they have the will and the passion to be involved in science or math or technology, they should be encouraged to do so, even if they lack some language proficiency. And it's, in my opinion, the role of the school and the teachers to remedy this lack in language proficiency. This also goes back to, well, June, the book by Frank Herbert, in which he says that growth is limited by the necessity, which is present in the least amount. And your growth in science will be limited by the lack of language you have to discuss the science. But so the first thing you should do then is to let the students acquire the language that is necessary. But you should not first submerge them into a language path, and then only then they can partake in the science, because just by being in the classroom with the other kids, they will automatically pick up a lot of the vocabulary and the phrasing that is necessary. And otherwise, you're just taking learning opportunities away from them.
It's a really interesting perspective, and I think I tend to agree with you there. How do you think that technology teachers can become best prepared to become language teachers and teach the academic language that is used and the conversations that are typical for technological discourse?
I think the first thing you should be aware of that language is a lot more than using the right vocabulary. While it is absolutely essential that a student knows that the earth doesn't really turn around the sun, but revolves around it, for example, as they would often mistranslate it from Dutch to English. But it's a lot more than that. There's phrasing, but also there's certain genres that are unique to the sciences or to the scientific process. Every research paper is structured in the same way. So, and once you've seen how the recipe is made, you can always bake the same cake. I can write a nonsensical paper, of course, about this, auto mechanics, for example, because I know what the structure of the paper is going to be like. My research would be quite useless, of course, because I have no expertise in the field, but I know how to structure it. And seeing structures is more important than anything else. And to be able to see structures, you need to be able to develop a real sense of critical thinking. So one of the first things to do is not only see that language is a lot more than learning vocabulary and phrasing, but also to become really good at the Socratic method and to know what a good question is. I think a lot of the questions that are asked in classrooms are more of advices that are being given, or the checking of hypotheses, or to give an opinion to a student. While normally from a language and also a philosophy standpoint, a good question is an invitation to think and to reflect and to connect and to research together. And that's the basis of language. It's not only how you think, but it's the way in which you think. It's the creation of just sounds to discuss the world around us. And I can invent a new word with you right now to discuss something in the world that has no name before, and it will pop up in your mind. And that's the real powerful thing. And I think that language teachers first to be, science and technology teachers, they want to become kind of a language teacher, but to think about vocabulary and to make good questions, but also to really think about what words and phrasing and structures they themselves didn't know when they started out in this field. What were your hindrances? What were the obstacles you confronted? Always think from the standpoint of the children in your classroom. What is the biggest hindrance that they can encounter? And not only stipulate some lesson goals for yourself, but also language goals. What's the language you want those kids to learn by the end of the class? Because in Flanders, I cannot speak for Canada or the rest of the world, but in Flanders, we know from our research that a lot of teachers, they want the kids to be able to separate a salt in a chemical way. And that's a good thing, obviously, but now I say separation, which is obviously chemically speaking and total untrue, but there are some words for that. What words should you use? And that's the biggest thing, that they don't really pay attention to the language the kids should use. And then you pose a question on your exam or your test, and they don't understand the question, but they know the process and they just cannot describe it.
Building on that, how might one convince technology teachers that do not see themselves as language teachers to understand the importance of that role?
Well, that's also a good question. That's a question we get a lot when we teach our teachers in our research, because it is a lot of work, but it is a lot of work that is being done in the short term, while you reap the benefits long term. If you always have to explain and re-explain something to your pupils, you will lose valuable instruction time. But if you do it right from the first time and you pay attention to all language goals, you actually win time in the long run. But it is the acquirement of this method takes some time, of course. And that is an investment that a lot of teachers may be unwilling to take at first, especially if you're just starting out in teaching, because there's so much that you already need to acquire, that you paying attention to the language that is being used in your classroom is just something that will lead to a cognitive overload. But if you have the time, you will reap benefits long term. But it is, I cannot stress it enough, and I've seen it happen a lot. It is a lot of work to do it right the first time. And you also kind of need to fail a few times to see how it can be done better. But that goes for everything with teaching, in my opinion. You can try at something and it may not work the first time, but don't give up and try it again, and you will feel more at ease, and somehow magically it will work the third time.
With that being said, do you think that teachers already trained in language teaching, such as FSL or ESL, going into technology teaching, have any sort of leg up in regards to teaching tech?
They can, but it's not necessarily so. If they have been well versed in how to learn languages and how to teach languages, they can have a real leg up, but it's not necessarily so. For example, we see a lot of teachers who teach Dutch, which is one of the languages that's spoken here in Antwerp most frequently, that's really struggled to convey concepts as morphology and syntax in a good way when it comes to the language that is being used. And those are all language teachers. And somehow they fail when it comes to talking about die-hard grammar, as I call it now, because it's a hard subject to teach. So I think that also for science and technology teachers that may have a background in teaching languages, they can have some kind of a bonus, but that's not true in every aspect. They can have that bonus if they are aware of what they're doing and if they remember that they have a treasure map to go looking for the treasures that I mentioned 3 questions before. Then they will be better at what they do. So they can be better. But a science teacher who has had really good teacher training and has learned how to build his own treasure map can be just as good.
To build a bit on what we were talking about earlier, does English act as a global reserve currency of sorts within the field of science and technology? And how significant of a barrier should this create for getting younger students around the world involved in STEM education?
I don't think it's a real barrier to success. Speaking for Europe, which I know best, I think in general, our English education is quite good. So the fact that you need to acquire English to be at equal pace with the English-speaking world is an effort, to be sure, but it's not something that might put you at a huge disadvantage. If you go into computer sciences, you know that you will be studying in English. It's just a part of it. And speaking for Dutch, my mother tongue, we often don't even translate English words coming out of computer sciences, for example. It's just, this is the English word we use right now. A computer is just computer in Dutch, which is also good if you would want to learn Dutch at some point. But that eliminates some barriers. There are other languages around the world that may be more protectionistic about their vocabulary, and then you have to learn a whole new language to study as well. That may be a barrier, because if you have to learn both the academic language and English, that will be quite a burden for you as a student. But speaking for my country, I don't think it will be for most students. There will be some students who struggle with this, but I don't see, if I look around me at my university college, also in the graphical and design media, everyone just uses Photoshop and Illustrator and everything from Adobe in English, and no one ever uses a Dutch version, because you're just out of luck if you want to look up a tutorial on YouTube, because then all the words are different. So I don't think they sell much Dutch copies of that software here. So no, but it can be around the world, but not where I live.
Okay, so coming back to the topic as a whole, we just want to ask you, in what direction would you like to see the research in this field head?
I think the most interesting combination for me, of course, speaking as a language professor and policy advisor, is that there is a bigger combination of both language teaching and science and technology teaching. It's one of the things I find sometimes a bit frustrating about our field, that or education in general. We sometimes have a view of teaching where everyone is his own emperor in his classroom. And when someone else enters, it's almost seen as an invasion and you want to kick him out of your turf, so to speak. But the biggest goal I think you can have as a teacher is that they will become better in Dutch by being better in chemistry and vice versa. And I think that there's a real modality shift that needs to take place in education where all the emperors in their classroom see that they're just all, medieval dukes or barons working for the same king. And that king is actually not the head of the department or everything, but just the student they serve. And they all have some expertise, and it's by combining the expertise that the real growth for the king is being possible.
Okay, so for the last bit, we're going to take a question from the audience. And one commenter said, is there a hypothetical methodology in pedagogy that systematically covers language so that students can become proficient, or should it be done on a more case-by-case basis?
That's a really good question. There are some key principles that can be used in all language classes and also in every other class, from science to math to technology. And you should always focus on the context that the students need to learn and what they already know, the interaction that you provide as the teacher to talk about this context, and then also the language support that you give them during class. That should always be the three pillars that you build your language teaching around. But then again, there are some specific cases that require additional and maybe care that you are not able to give. Dyslexia, for example, may be something that is out of your comfort zone to try and remedy. And then I'm not even discussing things like aphasia, which is a real issue. Bilingualism is always a strong point, but is often seen as a weakness. But multilingualism should be treated in a better way, but now is often seen in a rather bad fashion, but this should be an individual approach to that as well. What other languages does this kid know that he can also use to make a cross-linguistical transfer? Because then this kid has 2 or even 3 possible mental lexica from which he can really build connections between all words, and that should be done with some personal attention. There is no one rule fits all for this kind of subject.
Thank you for telling us about all of that. We really found this interview quite useful in giving some insight into how language can be utilized in the professional world. And I'm sure all of our watchers might be able to use that as they move forward in the professional world. So I'm going to thank you again, and if you have any last comments you'd like to make, now would be a good time to make it as we finish off the stream.
Okay, thank you once again for having me, and to everyone in the audience. Please always just keep on reading. It's the most beautiful thing there is. And also read to the kids in your classroom later. There's always books that talk about science, technology, and mathematics. We here in Antwerp always try to bring literature into the classroom and really make an effort to do it into the science classrooms as well. So it would be great if we can see that ripple go across the Atlantic Ocean as well.
Okay, well, that ends our stream. Thank you and have a good rest of your day, everybody.
Right. Bye.